in my intermediate and highest classes. And the reason why that is because of the classification scheme I'm using, the way I've broken up all my data into categories. And also the number of categories or classes that I'm using. So here, notice there's this classes drop down where I can specify more or fewer classes. So if I drop this down to 3, for instance, and say apply, now my symbols are so tiny. We'll come back to classification in a minute with the polygons. I think these are a little too hard to see. I think let's also try graduated symbols for our points. So let's use our population attribute again. And now let's change the size of the symbols. So if I go to my value field, to that drop down, and say pop max, again, the default is to have 5 groups or 5 classes, going from very small to fairly large symbols. And now I'll say apply, and I'll move this out of the way so we can look at it. And what do you think about this map? Way easier to read, for one. And then now we can see patterns, right? Pretty easily. So there's a center, there's a population center, there's a population center. You know, not many up there, right? But you know, it's fairly intuitive. It makes sense for something like population. This type of symbolization really brings out those areas where it's very high. All right. So I'm going to close. I'm going to just accept these changes. I'm going to say OK to close this window. And now, like I said, let's take a look at classification a little more. But let's use our state polygons instead of our cities. So I'm going to turn off my USA major cities by unchecking it in the box. I'll also turn off rivers for now. And I want to open the layer properties and go to the symbology tab. So how do I do that? Right click on it. Let's open those layer properties. First, I'm going to open my attribute table. I know we looked at this before, but I'll point it out again. We have a population field. So let's try making a similar map to what we tried with cities. But let's use our state borders as well. So there are, again, we could try using categories, but for numeric data, we want to do quantities. So let's click that quantities tab. And we have the same type of options for us. We have graduated colors, graduated symbols, proportional symbols, and so on. So my value field, I'm going to click, drop down, and say pop 2013. And again, the default is 5 classes, and mine has this red to green color ramp. I'm just going to say apply, and then take a look at the map. Is anybody colorblind with red-green? I mean, I'm not trying to focus on anybody, but that's another thing to consider when you make a map. I've taught this workshop in the past, or somebody said, I can't tell the difference. You know, it's like some states are okay, but you know, it's something you have to consider from time to time. So what do you think about this map right away? What do you notice? States in red have the highest population. That makes sense. Red's a warmer color than green, so my brain immediately says Texas, California, Florida, New York. These are the highest. And then again, we have, looks like lower populations in the upper Midwest and western states. So now let's try making changes to the number of classes. I'm going to go to this drop down, and I'm going to put it down to 3 and just see what happens. So and what does that do to the map? I see as far as the highest values, they stayed about the same. It's just lumped the rest of them into a low and middle category. Now let's put it up to 10 classes and see what happens. So I'll say 10 classes and take a look at the map. And what do you think about this one? Is there any more information in this map than when there were 5 classes?
Yeah. You have different shades now.
You have different shades?
Yeah, like Florida, New York are more orange now.
Right, Florida and New York are different from Texas and California. If I stand further away from it though, and then Idaho is different from Wyoming, but I might lose the fact that New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado are different. This is sort of confusing. I can't immediately tell which state is higher or lower than another one. There's more information there, but I need to have a legend along with it to interpret the colors. When you use more classes, you can convey more information, but you run the risk of it being hard to interpret very rapidly. As a rule, I've seen not more than 9 classes in a map. I would say the fewer the better, and more than 5 is probably too many in most cases. So I use as few as possible to tell the story or message that you intend.
So there's no way to discretely assign colors to those. It's all on the color map.
We could. I'm going to, for this example, just make it 2 classes to make it really fast. You can assign the color ramp, but if I click here on this box, I can change the symbol just like I could at any other time, and it will not respect that color ramp. So I can make it blue and pink if I want to, right?
I think that would be better as far as if you were trying to get data across its very finely delineated.
Yes, right? That's a good point. The color scale we use, if I put this back to 5, I can customize it, and I can go back to a default color scale at any time. But if you click this drop down in the color ramp, you can see there's all sorts of colors and scales, right? We could do a rainbow and see how that looks. We can try, I don't know, you can feel free to experiment for a second. Some have an intended purpose, some don't. Generally for things where you're trying to show high and low values, you'll want something that varies across 1 color or maybe 2 to 3 colors. If you use the rainbow effect, like this one here, for instance, it gets a little muddy, right? It's not clear what you're trying to say. Single colors are generally the easiest to interpret on their own, as long as there's enough distinction between the shades. But that's a good point. So now what I want to do is, I'm going to switch back to the green and red color map that we're used to. And now let's talk about the classification scheme. So there are different methods of breaking your data into groups. The default is what's called the natural breaks method, or Jenks method. And you can see that here. If you click this classify button, you'll see another window that opens up. And now you can actually see a histogram of your data. And you can see these blue lines represent the separations in the class. And here at the top, under the classification method, there are different ways of breaking up the data. You can do it totally manually and define all of the classes. You could do an equal interval, which is where there's some unit that separates the classes, and then it will break up the range using that unit. You can also do a quantile method, where you're going to break up based on some percentage of your data. So with 5 classes, it'd be the lowest 20%, and then middle, 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 and highest 20%. You can do a number of other methods here. Natural breaks, or the Jenks method, is usually good for data that are not normally distributed, or they're not uniformly distributed. Here you can see most populations, or most states, fall into this lowest category. And then the Jenks method looks for natural breaks in the data, or it tries to maximize the difference between classes, and as well as maximizing the similarity within each class. Does that make sense? So it's trying to put the things that are most similar together and most different apart from one another. So you can see these 4 states here have a much, much higher population than most of the rest of them. Again, we can say equal interval, or we can go to quantile. For instance, just say OK, and then apply. And now I have a map of each 20% of states and the category they fall into. Things like the quantile